And I'm very pleased to have Dr. Ann Gearity here with us today. She will say a little bit more about her work, but she has done numerous trainings for us in our work to connect research with practice. So we're very pleased to have her with us. Thank you, Ann.
So thank you all for being here. I'm very appreciative that this is a long day and your brains are probably filled and exhausted. So I will do my best to keep this active and interactive. I try not to change too many slides, but I did change some. So I put up my email. If there's slides that you really want, feel free to email me. My job is to be the integrationist. So I'm supposed to take everything that Bonnie said and everything that Nimi said and turn it into practice, which is pretty impossible. So what I'm going to try and do is think about adolescents who are struggling and some of the intervention principles that we can think about and use in our work as a way of integrating what we've learned. So for this presentation, I'm going to try and integrate the research, but I think I'll do it mostly informally. I'm going to really focus on how relational expectations in adolescence reveal both early experiences that they bring into adolescence, but also can be changed by current experiences because adolescence is a time of change and transformation. I'm going to briefly touch on the effects of trauma because I think a lot of us who attend this conference work with populations that have that as an added mix in their adolescent development. And I really want to finish with how do you use relational regulatory support in your practice. We talked about evidence-based practices, and there certainly are many. But what I'm going to argue is, and it fits with what Dr. Singh was saying, that so much of motivational change happens not only because the person wants to change, but the person trusts the provider so that they can take the experience in. So I'm going to really try to think about how to make our interventions both research grounded but also experiential so that we can provide a force that's in contrast to the stress experiences. So I just want to unpack today's title a little and look at teens managing emotions, this idea of dysregulation, challenging behaviors, and then finish with responding to. So first of all, teens. Carrie started it by talking about development, and it's really important to say that teens are in a developmental stage. Now that we know that often adolescence begins with the onset of puberty, but even that has become a little complicated with more and more children having early onset. So we know it's a biopsychosocial phenomena. It covers at least a decade of important learning, and it facilitates independence, identity, social engagement, and pro-social functioning. The goal of adolescence is to become an adult. So the tasks of adolescence, when we think of the tasks, and we had some reference to this as we heard both Bonnie and Nimi, the first is identity, right? The adolescent has to figure out who am I? And who am I means coming up with a kind of declaration. It also means a lot of ownership of body and mind. So I often use the idea that up until adolescence, childhood, the parent-child relationship is kind of like a joint checking account. But as the adolescent moves into greater independence, we have to remove ourselves from the signing page because they have to more and more do it themselves. So that idea that Nimi talked a lot about, how do you help an adolescent own his body, own her mind? The third task is really a consolidated sense of self. And, when we talk about problem solving, we're not just talking about coming to a solution, but we're really talking about coming to a self-awareness that I can find solutions. So that idea of this is not only who I am, but these are the resources that I bring into my experience and the sense of competency that gives me pleasure and self-efficacy. We know the fourth task of adolescence is very much a future orientation with plans. And any of us who work with adolescents know that we're always looking for that energy that says we're going to move. So not just the physical energy, I can move my body, but the psychological energy that says I can move my life forward. And we get very worried for teens who have very restricted energy to move forward. And the last thing that adolescents are doing is moving towards intimacy. Now, I underline towards, because I think a lot of our culture is pushing adolescents into a kind of premature adaptation of intimacy when they really don't know who they are yet. So we have to be aware of that tension, that they're often moving into intimacy, not as intimacy, but as a kind of pseudo-identity that can cause a lot of problems. Oh, I'm sorry. Oop, I think I almost turned it off. Sorry. Okay, wrong button. So when we think of adolescence, we're always going to stay in the 4 domains of functioning. And any intervention has to activate all 4 domains. Now, we talk about entry points. You know, sometimes we go into a cognitive entry point because the adolescent wants to think about himself. Sometimes we go in an emotional entry point because emotions are dominant. Sometimes we go in a behavior entry point because the behaviors are the most concern, or because the adolescent has a lot of strengths in deciding how he can act and what he wants to do. The relational entry point is a critical one because although adolescents are in the process of firing their parents, they're not firing us. Right? So they're firing their parents in the service of expanding, of moving out from their primary relationships into including a lot of other people. So those of us who are lucky to work with adolescents have this very wonderful experience where I can say things to the teenager that his mom and dad couldn't dare say. And we really want to see that as a privilege. So the relating, now all these domains contribute to the growing capacity for self-regulation. So we want to stay with the centrality of self-regulation. Bonnie introduced a lot of data about the neurobiology of self-regulation. Nimi introduced a lot about the physical biology of regulation and well-being. So I want to define it. Self-regulation is simply the neurological, biological, and psychological capacity to maintain and regain balance, right, in the face. And what gets us off balance is in the face of fear and strong emotions, in the face of stimulation coming from inside or out, or in the face of change and new learning. So the idea of self-regulation is not that it's static. It's not that the child achieves self-regulation at some date in time and has it. We're constantly regulated and dysregulated. If somebody sneezes, they're a little bit dysregulated. So that's why that idea of maintain and regain is really important. And we want to be looking at not just the teen who can be mostly regulated, but also this capacity that when you get tipped over, how do you right yourself? So that self-righting capacity that is very much tied to early relational access then has to be incorporated into their body so that they can start to do it for themselves. I'm working with a 9-year-old now whose mother has died, and whenever something goes wrong, he just falls apart. And the language we've developed is, no wonder you're missing your mom right now because your art project didn't work. And people need their moms when their art projects don't work. Right? And it's being very helpful so that he starts to see that what he's experiencing is not just frustration, but a sense of missing that regulatory partnering. Now, the adolescent has to start shifting. Were you shocked when I said adolescents fire you? Fire the parents? I mean, any of you felt fired? It's so painful. They fire you in the parent job. They keep you as a relational importance. But that process of giving up that regulatory partnership in the service of taking it into myself is so much the work of adolescence. So I put up this sleep one again so that we'd all remember not just the importance of sleep, but the vulnerability of adolescence to the current culture. When Nimi was talking, I have to admit, I love my iPad, and it is killing my sleep. I'm reading books on the iPad. I am going through withdrawal. I can't because I don't sleep as well. So there's a cultural quality of adolescence that we have to remember. They're growing up in a context. And we've been talking some of the contexts that they have to experience. Screens are certainly one of the contexts, the kind of cultural norms. So we want to remember that often with adolescents who are distressed, we are pushing against the norm. We are asking them to act on their own behalf, different than their peer group, which can be really, really challenging. So saying to a teen, you should be in bed by 10, when his friends are going to bed at 2 and 3 in the morning, is asking him to do an extraordinary act of self-protection that really goes against the push of adolescence, which is to be with his peer group. Now, I like the point that Nimi raised, because it's the one thing I found is helpful, especially with adolescent boys, telling them that if they stay up all night, the growth hormone won't kick in. Really works. They go, whoa, very good. All right? So the second part we want to unpack is managing feelings. So we've been talking about stress, we've been talking about cognition, we've been talking about eating and sleeping. Why feelings? Emotions are really at the core of functioning, and one of the most important changes in our understanding of human development is a kind of rehabilitation of emotions. Descartes' statement, I think, therefore I am, is incorrect. It really is I feel so that my body and mind gets activated so I can appraise and decide how to move. And feelings are really at the core. Emotions and emotion regulation signal us to appraise situations and to decide how to act. People who have damage to their limbic systems often are poor deciders on how to act, because we need our emotions to know what to do. To use cognition, the teen must have some capacity for emotional stability. Right? To think requires emotional stability. So early today, someone asked about CBT, and clinically, a lot of us find that CBT is not effective, especially with very dysregulated teens, and it's because they don't have the emotional stability to get to those cognitions that can help them problem solve. So we have to think about, just as the brain is bottom to top, sometimes our interventions need to be bottom to top. The problem of emotional dysregulation. Emotions that are confusing or poorly modulated fail to provide the kind of energy needed for effective action and compromise both awareness and relating. This idea of energy, I think, is really a helpful metaphor for teens. If you can talk about the energy that you need, and we're not just talking about Red Bull energy, we're really talking about that kind of integrated energy that you have to figure out what's going on inside of you and what you want to do. And when emotions are highly dysregulated, the teen doesn't have the capacity for self-awareness. And that inability to have self-awareness can really interfere with both his actions and his relating. So we'll talk about. So dysregulation is the opposite. We know that stress is a necessary part of life. We heard this morning how important and inevitable stress is. What we want to pay attention to is this idea of tolerable stress. For simplification, I call tolerable stress enough to activate the brain with enough resources so the task is manageable, and enough adult mediation so that the teen doesn't feel overwhelmed. Right? And then stress is tolerable. So we want to recognize that stress is important. We don't want to try to eliminate stress. We're not saying that teens should have a stress-free life. A lot of times we see parents who try very hard to take away all of their teens' stress, and they do as much harm as the parent who can't mediate that stress. Toxic stress is when there's too much stimulation, so the brain is overwhelmed, with too few resources so the child doesn't have a chance of mastery, and too little adult mediation. So we're really thinking about those three components, and any one of those three components can tip tolerable or useful stress into overwhelming stress. So you can see where I'm interested in the third part, adult mediation, because that may be the part I can control. All right, so dysregulation is a chronic state of unbalance. I'm going to skip this one. We don't need this. We can kind of go on. Okay. So Bonnie had an interesting chart. And this is a chart that talked about, a capacity for control. And her red line, when I wrote to her and said, what does this mean? She said, the red line is the gas. And I thought, the gas, what does that stand for? I must have missed that, and she just meant the drive, the energy. So what happens in adolescence is that your need to get satisfaction, all right? You need to, remember, I can't get no satisfaction. The need to get satisfaction is particularly high, and it exceeds your capacity for control. So we know that adolescents are quite vulnerable to dysregulation because often their desires and wishes and drives exceed their capacities and control. And so we're concerned about adolescent vulnerability. Now, the fourth part we want to talk about is examining challenging behaviors. Right? So we want to understand behaviors. And we want to think of behaviors as the teen's best effort to make his life work. Behaviors are either used to maintain internal balance or to shift the misery into interpersonal relationships when the teen is stressed. I often say to students, before you try and change your behavior, admire it. And I'm going to say that to you too. Before you try to change your behavior, admire it, because what you're seeing is the teen's best effort to make something work. And work is both about the internal state. I want to behave in a way that keeps my internal balance because we have such a need to maintain that homeostasis. But it's also an effort to manage the interpersonal experience. So I'm going to behave in a way that regulates my interpersonal experiences. Now, behavior is complicated because often I'm not behaving out of the stimulus that's immediately in front of me, but I'm behaving out of my historical stimulus. Remember Nimi said about animals, after they're terrified, they shake it off. I love that phrase because one time I fell in a most embarrassing way, and a colleague said to me, oh, here's what my friend says to her 2-year-old, shake it off. And I thought, oh, that's such a good idea, shake it off. But we don't shake it off very easily. And we know that early experiences is represented in very profound and implicit ways in the human mind. Part of what makes us so interesting is that we remember. What we remember is not only explicit but implicit, or to use the old terms, conscious and unconscious. So a lot of times what we see in challenging behaviors is a very complex story about what the child has expected from other people through their life, how those expectations have been satisfied or not, and how they've carried those unconscious or implicit expectations into the new arena. Right? So when we think about challenging behaviors, we want to think about them not as he's doing it to me on purpose, but as he's trying to regain regulation. And how is it working for him? So we're going to, as we talk, we're going to talk about behaviors. Are they working or are they not? Or another way of putting it, is it costing too much? So emotional confusion and challenging behaviors go hand in hand, kind of like love and marriage. And often when teens behave in erratic or confusing or self-abusing ways, or relationally destructive ways, those are reflections not just of what they have learned to do, but how they're feeling about themselves. And I think a lot of times we get so caught up on trying to change the behavior that we miss the story. We miss the communication. So as we think about challenging behaviors, we really want to keep that emotional message as an incorporated part. One of the things that I've started to do in consultations more that's really effective is when someone's talking about a case and they're talking about all the terrible things that the teen is doing. I'll say to the clinician, okay, stop for a minute and talk to me like you're the teen. Use his voice. And then they'll start to do it in a third-person way. And I'll say, no, do it in a first-person way. Become the teen and talk to me. And what's fascinating is that almost always good clinicians will get the teen's internal state in about 2 minutes. they'll start talking, if not less, they'll start talking about, well, I don't care because, I can do whatever I want. And very quickly, they'll go into a monologue that really captures the teen's anxiety and distress. So we often know what our clients are feeling, what is their internal state of mind, but we get so busy describing how they look or the impact that they're having on other people that we lose their perspective. So it's a really nice perspective exercise. Try it. Just say, and I do it to myself as I'm driving home. I'll be thinking about a case and then I'll try to talk, say, okay, how would he say what happened? And it just changes everything. Okay, so we have to remember that part of challenging behaviors is also, I said that they carry the story of the child's relational experiences, but they often carry the story of the child's trauma and stress. Right? And often stress and trauma, historical and in the past, unlike the zebra, continues to interfere with the teen's behavioral management in the present. So again, Bonnie talked about the neurobiological stress model, and she talked about the long high road and the short road. Right? Other drawings have talked about it as the fast route and the short route, the slow route. So the slow route, or the high road, is where you are calm enough that when your body starts to be aroused, you can pause and you can pull data from the past, conscious data from the past, and you can pull ideas and problem solving so that you don't rush into a reaction that's going to be more harmful. Unfortunately, many of the teens that we work with, especially the teens who have been traumatized, are habituated to the low road or the fast route. Now, when I say habituated, I'm not saying they choose it. This is an example of unconscious or implicit process. It's not that they're saying, wow, I'm going to go the shortcut and get excited and reactive fast. It happens like this. Right? So that short route is when the brain gets so stimulated and activated with both present trigger and past memories that it has to act quickly for its perceived survival. Right? So a lot of us who work with traumatized children end up doing harm when we don't help them see that their reactivity is happening unconsciously or implicitly, and that it's not serving them well. Because it's in that recognition that they're highly reactive that we start repairing self-regulation and self-control or internal control. When we always respond to them with external control, right, and consequences as if that's their choice, rather than there's body habituation, then we lose the opportunity to help them. Right? So the fifth thing I said was responding to in our title, which means a lot more than watching or fighting with or feeling free. I saw this on Google. You can find anything. This is a 911 call. At the end of my driveway, it's some kids fighting, and it's adults there watching. And I think that a lot of times with adolescents, even though adolescents do need to be separating from us, adults fail them by watching instead of responding. So I want to talk a lot today in my time about how do you respond to teens so that we can show them the way out of challenging behaviors and dysregulation and help them get a sense of what works. One of the most interesting research, I think, and there's so much interesting research in the past 10 years, but is an increasing understanding of how we learn, right? And that we don't learn didactically. So here we are being didactic. We don't learn by being lectured. We learn by experiencing, and we learn by modeling, right? That our brains are primed to model things that we're invested in, and our brains are activated for new learning when our amygdala is turned on, when there's feeling, enough feeling that our brain is alive, but not so much feeling that we're overwhelmed. And that's how we learn. So in responding, I think we have a choice as clinicians to respond in ways that are helpful or to respond in ways that inadvertently reinforce dysregulation, maladaptation, and estrangement. So many of you know my work with younger children on developmental repair. And while developmental repair is a lot more work for teenagers because they have a lot more that they've already learned, and they're much more set into their patterns of relating and functioning, it still has incredible value because adolescence is a transitional age. We know that there's 3 times where the human psyche is particularly open. One is when we're very young, one is when we're teenagers, and one is when we're parents of the very young. So we want to take seriously that adolescence is a time that we can help them new ways. So let me talk about some intervention principles, and I use the idea of resilience. So resilience is just the capacity for positively adapting in the face of adversity. And we're going to assume that most of the teens that we work with have had adversity. It's a very generic term. And the idea of resilience is the ability to bounce back, again, a regulatory process, in the face of adversity and keep developing. All right, so we're going to use that concept of resilient. How do we help the adolescent body and mind stay resilient? Resilience can look a couple of ways. The first drawing is the resilience that we all wish. You know, once you start, it's a straight road up. But in fact, the research tells us that resilience also often looks more like the second. That most teens with adversity will have periods of better functioning and then drops, and then better functioning and drops. And that's really important. Another thing we need to know about resilience, and especially for our high-risk kids, high-risk teens, is that resilience can often be maintaining a status quo. One of the biggest gifts I got when I was doing my developmental repair work was one of the consultants, who I'm going to mention here, said to me that for my population, which is very, very at-risk young children, staying the same was actually progress. That not getting worse was progress. And a lot of times, especially with our demands on outcome, we're forced to sort of wish that we could get the first drawing. And we have to develop some language that helps us understand why the second drawing may also be the reality. And I think I can show you how. And I'm going to skip this. All right, now there are some threats to resilience that we have to just name right out, because this will remind many of you of your clients. The first threat to resilience is persisting and unrelenting risks. I was talking to a colleague a little while ago, and we were just comparing notes on her population. You know, and some of our kids, Nimi, you were talking about moving, and one of the comments she made was running shoes. Half my kids don't even have shoes. So persistent and unrelenting risks is a huge threat to resilience, right? Because you just get so beaten down, and the teen has to have some feeling of efficacy, right? So much of resilience is efficacy. The second threat to resilience is peer group dominance versus individual motivation. We know that in normal development, early stage teens love the peer group, right? 13 is probably the only age where you can show up at school with the same sweatshirt as 3 other people, and it's nirvana. It's so wonderful to be the same, right? But over the course of adolescence, through middle adolescence, which is probably 14 to 16, 17, and then into later adolescence, there's a shift out of the peer group into increasing individual motivation. That's your sense of self. And so we have to be really concerned when, for whatever reason, peers can't find that individual sense of self and that individual motivation. A third threat to resilience is really the one I just talked about, which is the social context, poverty and ongoing social and economic vulnerability. You know, I think we're being very aware with some of these horrific episodes, Sandy Hook, Aurora, that we're looking at young people who were shunned. And I think we really have to start thinking about that word shunned. and how are teens shunned in our community, and how do we create environments where there's not that sense of shunning, where you can be different without being shunned. The fourth is a coherence versus a breakdown of narrative. And Nimi talked about the importance of narrative, so you'll see why that becomes so important. When your narrative breaks down or becomes incoherent, it's harder to maintain that sense of self. And a lot of our teens have particularly incoherent narratives, particularly the ones in the foster care system. All right? Their narratives are incoherent because they can't make a story that is user-friendly. So we're always trying to help teens develop a user-friendly story. And the fifth is dangers of continuity. You know, teens, again, it goes back to that image of resilience. I think a lot of teens who struggle not only struggle with internal pain, but end up struggling with community attributions. He's always that way. He'll never change. And we have to be aware that adolescence is a time of incredible change potential. And our job is to really see that. So I want to talk about a contempt and the problem of contempt. All right, we know that in some relational research, John Gottman's work on couples, that you can tell when a couple is doing well because they do not have contempt. You can tell when a couple is struggling because there's a lot of contempt. And I'm going to argue that contempt is one of the ways that I think teens get really hurt. Now, most teens are very sensitive to others' appraisal, even though they appear indifferent. All right? And contempt that is particularly toxic is when it comes from parents. I don't know if you've seen this, but maybe it's just on my mind lately, but I have a couple of cases where the parent is so contemptuous of the teen, even though they were the parents, when things went wrong. And it's sort of like, wait a second, you can't blame him. You know, this is all good family therapy stuff. But this idea of contempt, I think we really want to keep in our mind. Now, the opposite of contempt is probably interest. All right? It's not just kindness, but it's interest. And so as we go and talk about interventions, let's keep that in mind. Let me say something about diagnosis. I added this on because I think it's really important. There's lots of controversy right now about the DSM-5, and apparently as it's being printed, it's also being fired. You know, I don't think it quite worked. But there was an article in Nature just last week that talked about on the spectrum. And it talked about the trouble with categories is that rarely do people fit into any one category. And in fact, diagnoses is an attempt to nail down single entities when there's usually multiple entities. And so they're talking about this idea that what we try to do is we try to force people into one or the other when we need to be thinking of both and. And I think that interventions that overvalue diagnosis and undervalue development and functioning rob the teen of the space to survive. So I'm going to invite you, as we go through interventions, to think less about diagnoses and to see whether these ideas can be equally useful regardless of the diagnosis, because I think they will. Now, Carrie said something at the first talk, too. She talked about mental health as something that can, or mental distress can wax and wane. And so I always approach teens as in a developmental model. I always want to think about their development, and I want to think about what's working and what's not. So even with teens who are presenting with emerging mental illness, I want to think about what's working as much as I want to think about what's not. We have some pretty compelling research on early onset psychosis that argues that the more that the teen or young adult can be rehabilitated back into higher levels of functioning, the less likely that their illness will be lifelong and debilitating. But so often, because we focus so much on the diagnosis and we forget to focus on the rest of the teen, we burden them with an identity that is not rich and broad. So, what supports resilience? So I'm going to use as my research basis a book called Out of the Woods. It got a little collapsed in its translation. Out of the Woods was written by Stuart Hauser and Joe Allen. Stuart was at Harvard. Joe Allen is at the University of Virginia. They've done longitudinal quantitative research on at-risk teens. And in 2006, they decided to look at the pages and pages and pages of qualitative research that they'd connected. This is a study that's gone on for almost 40 years. And what they found in the narratives of the teens was that there were 3 protective qualities or capacities that they thought promoted resilience. And the 3 capacities were agency and the quest for mastery, looking inward, the capacity for reflection, and the pivotal importance of relationship interests. Right? So I want to use that and talk about why these are so important and how we use these in our interventions. The first is agency and mastery. And they describe, these are quotes, that these teens who proved resilience over this long haul had a belief that they could influence their environment as a dynamic living force. They exhibited an optimistic bias. They had optimistic beliefs about how much we change our environments, which not only inspire actions, but often also soften the inevitable failures and setbacks that accompany any bold course. All of the teens are impulsive at times, but the resilient ones also give their lives and problems steady and serious attention. Now, I think this idea of agency and mastery is really important when we think of some of our interventions for teens. Nimi was talking about motivational interviewing, but I'd like to talk about motivational interventions. When we try to support, when we try to impose external control, which is still a model that's being used in a lot of our facilities, where teens are told if they don't do this, then this will happen. It's a lot of imposing of external control. What we do is that we keep the power at the outside and we rob them of their normative desire and interest in agency. When we can shift to a model that supports internal control and encourages internal control and encourages internal awareness of how can you fix this so it works. Now, it doesn't mean abandoning reality. It doesn't mean saying to the teen, you get to do whatever you want, because the teen is terribly invested in relationships. So it's saying to the teen, you need to use your resources to figure out a solution, right? And it has to be a solution that works for you, but also works for me. Now, I do that all the time with teams. I'd say, it sounds like this is a problem, so let's pretend that I'm the teacher. So figure out something that works for you and works for me. And then sometimes I'll say to them, okay, now try to be in my shoes and see why I think that solution wouldn't work. I'm not asking you to take care of me, but I just want you to see. All right, now see if you can come up with anything else that maybe could get closer to working for both of us. All right, so it's taking that motivation, but it's also saying not only change your life, but think of yourself as an agent in your own world. Think of yourself as having the power to make it different. You know, a lot of times we ask children at the start of an intervention, I love this, what are your 3 wishes and what 3 things would you change? But that 3 things you wish you should change really has to stay a constant through the treatment. What do you want to change? What do you want to change? Not just what do you want to change so that they can gripe, but what do you want to change and how would you change it? Right? So that, again, keeping that sense of agency always on them.